The sound of his son's weeping should have been just another noise Han Musuk ignored. Another minor fracture in the disciplined, iron-clad world he'd built for his heir. But as Ji-hoon's sobs grew louder, vibrating against the fine crystal of the restaurant, something raw and dangerously impatient stirred inside him. Musuk had silenced powerful men for less than the public humiliation he felt radiating from the boy's flushed face. "Stop," he said, his voice a low, lethal vibration, the same tone he used when signing death warrants. Ji-hoon flinched, his small frame trembling in his neat button-down shirt, but the tears only fell faster. That reflexive shudder, that visible terror of his own father, ignited a frustration in Musuk that had nothing to do with the syndicates he controlled through blood and fear. For the first time since taking over the Han organization, the most powerful man in the city felt completely powerless. He raised a hand to signal his men, but before the guards could move, a shadow fell over the table. "He isn't being disobedient, Mr. Han," a voice interrupted, calm and grounded. "He's just lost." Musuk froze, and the world shifted between the Mafia boss and the waitress who dared to speak. Sophia Diallo had served the elite at the Gilded Lily for 3 years by perfecting the art of the invisible African. To the wealthy men in tailored suits, she was merely a pair of steady hands, a tilt of the head, and a silent ghost who kept the water glasses full. She knew the rules. Don't make eye contact, don't offer opinions, and never ever disturb the silence of a man like Han Musuk. Invisibility was Sophia's armor. 24 years of navigating a world that saw her skin before her soul had taught her how to move without disturbing the air. She had learned to quiet her breathing around the powerful, and to keep her own stories buried deep beneath her professional white vest and bow tie. Today that armor cracked. She had seen the way the boy's eyes squeezed shut, not in a tantrum, but in a desperate search for someone who wasn't there. She knew that look. She had worn it herself when she first arrived in this cold city. Her manager would fire her for speaking out of turn. The rent on her small apartment was 3 days late, and her family back home was counting on her next wire transfer. But as Musuk's severe eyes narrowed at his son, Sophia didn't see a mafia boss. She saw a child drowning in a room full of sharks. So Sophia Diallo didn't walk away. She stepped into the danger zone and leaned down toward the boy. Sophia moved through the dining room of the Gilded Lily like a shadow cast against velvet. She was a master of the peripheral, a flicker of motion that ensured a water glass was never empty, a napkin never skewed, and a crumb never lingered. At 24, she had learned that in a city of glass towers and steel hearts, her greatest asset was her ability to be present without being perceived. She was a quiet hum in the background of the lives of people who spent more on a single bottle of wine than her mother earned in a year back in Senegal. The evening had a predictable rhythm of clinking silver and hushed negotiations until the heavy oak doors swung open, and the air in the room seemed to vanish. The Han Syndicate didn't just enter a room. They occupied it. 6 men in charcoal suits moved with a synchronized predatory grace, fanning out to secure the perimeter with a single sharp nod from their lead. In the center of the phalanx walked Han Musuk. He was a pillar of restrained violence, dressed in a suit so sharp it looked like it could draw blood. His face was a mask of marble, severe, handsome, and entirely unreadable. To anyone else, he was a king of the underworld. To Sophia, watching from the safety of the server station, he looked like a man who had forgotten how to breathe anything but smoke. But it was the small, trembling figure anchored to his side that broke the room's sophisticated silence. Han Ji-hoon couldn't have been more than 7. He was dressed in a miniature version of the men around him, a crisp white shirt and dark trousers, but the formality only made his distress more jarring. He wasn't throwing a tantrum, he was mourning. As they were seated at the central table, the boy's quiet whimpers escalated into a jagged, heartbreaking sob. The sound was an anomaly in the sterile elegance of the restaurant, a raw human emotion that the table of shadows wasn't equipped to handle. Musuk sat rigidly, his fingers interlaced on the white linen, his knuckles white. He didn't look at the child. He looked straight ahead, his jaw tight enough to crack bone, while his men shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting around the room to see who was watching the great Han Musuk lose control of a 7-year-old. Sophia felt the tension rising like a physical heat. Her manager was already hovering near the kitchen, his face pale, his hands gesturing frantically for the staff to stay away. The message was clear: let them handle it. Let the boy cry until he chokes or until his father loses his patience. But as Sophia watched a single tear track through the expensive foundation on the boy's cheek, she felt a familiar ache in her own chest. She knew what it was to be small and surrounded by giants who spoke only the language of power. She adjusted her tray, her heart thumping against her ribs, and began to walk toward the one table everyone else was running from. Sophia's footsteps were the only sounds that didn't carry the weight of fear. As she neared the table, the air grew cold, thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the metallic edge of a threat. One of the guards shifted, his hand moving toward the lapel of his jacket, his eyes a warning. But Sophia didn't look at him. She didn't even look at Han Musuk, whose gaze was now fixed on her like a predator watching a sudden, inexplicable movement in the brush. She set a small glass of warm milk and a sprig of dried lavender from the kitchen's garnish station on the table. The boy, Ji-hoon, didn't look up. His small body was racked with a kind of rhythmic, exhausting sobs that suggested he had been crying for hours. "The white lilies," Sophia said softly. Her voice wasn't a servant's whisper. It was a melody, steady and grounding. The sobbing hitched. Ji-hoon's eyes, red-rimmed and puffy, flickered open just a fraction. Musuk's entire body went still, a terrifying, absolute stillness. He hadn't spoken, but the question hung in the air like a blade. "How do you know?" Sophia leaned in closer, ignoring the guard who had stepped within a foot of her. She spoke only to the boy, her voice a secret shared in the middle of a war zone. "In the garden of the house with the blue gate, the white lilies always bloom when the rain starts. Your mother used to say they were the stars coming down to hide in the grass, didn't she?" Ji-hoon froze. The heavy, jagged breathing stopped. He looked at Sophia, really looked at her, seeing not a waitress in a black vest, but a keeper of a memory he thought was buried in the cold earth with his mother. Musuk's hand, which had been clenched into a white-knuckled fist on the table, slowly unfurled. His severe eyes narrowed, searching Sophia's face for a trick, for a threat, for an explanation. "She used to hum the song about the moon," Sophia continued, her voice feather-light. "The one that says the night is just a blanket to keep the flowers warm." A single quiet tear escaped Ji-hoon's eye, but the heaving of his chest subsided. He reached out a small, trembling hand and touched the dried lavender. For the first time that evening, the table of shadows felt a flicker of light. Musuk finally spoke. His voice was no longer a command, but it was edged with a new, sharper kind of intensity. "Who are you?" Sophia straightened her back, meeting the gaze of the city's most dangerous man without flinching. "I am the person who sees that your son is grieving, Mr. Han. And I am the person who knows that you are grieving too." The silence that followed was different than before. It wasn't the silence of death or authority. It was the silence of a man realizing that for all his power, his invisibility had just been shattered by a woman he hadn't even noticed 5 minutes ago. The following week felt like walking through a fever dream that refused to break. Sophia had expected a pink slip, a stern lecture from her manager, or perhaps a sudden, unexplained disappearance from the restaurant's schedule. Instead, there was only a heavy, expectant silence. She returned to her small apartment each night, locking the 3 deadbolts and listening to the hum of the city, wondering if the table of shadows had simply been a collective hallucination. That illusion shattered on a rainy Tuesday evening. Sophia was walking toward the bus stop, her coat collar turned up against the chill, when a black sedan smoothed to the curb beside her. The window rolled down with a mechanical purr, revealing the stone-cold profile of the guard from the restaurant. He didn't speak. He simply opened the back door. Sophia didn't run. In her world, running only made you a target. She stepped into the car, the scent of expensive leather and bergamot swallowing her whole. 10 minutes later, she was standing in an office that felt more like a fortress. Han Musuk sat behind a desk of dark obsidian, his silhouette framed by the sprawling, glittering lights of the city. He didn't look like a man who slept. He looked like a man who spent his nights counting his regrets and his enemies. He watched her for a long minute, his gaze a physical weight. "My son has not cried since that night," Musuk said, his voice cutting through the stillness like a wire. "But he has not spoken either. He sits by the window and waits for the woman who knows about the lilies." He stood up, moving with a controlled power that made the large room feel small. He stopped inches from her, his presence dominating her space. "I did a background check. You were born in Dakar. You moved here 6 years ago. You have no family in this country, yet you knew the details of a private garden in a village outside of Seoul, a place my wife loved, a place I have kept hidden from everyone." "I didn't need a file to see his heart, Mr. Han," Sophia replied, her voice soft but unwavering. "Grief has its own geography. I recognized the landmarks." Musuk's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something, admiration or perhaps fear, crossing his face. He reached into his desk and pulled out a contract. "The restaurant is no longer your concern. I am hiring you as Ji-hoon's personal aide. You will live in the estate. You will be his bridge back to the world." Sophia looked at the document. The salary listed was more than she could earn in a decade. It was freedom, safety, and a future for her mother. But she saw the invisible ink between the lines. Once she entered his world, there was no walking back out. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Musuk stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You saw me, Sophia. No one sees me and remains a stranger. You are already part of this." Sophia looked at the pen. She thought of the boy's lonely eyes and the man's hollow chest. She picked it up and signed. The estate was a monument to clinical perfection, a sprawling fortress of white marble and floor-to-ceiling glass perched high above the city's noise. Inside, the air felt thin and filtered, as if human warmth were a contaminant the ventilation system worked tirelessly to remove. There were no photographs on the walls, no stray toys on the floors, and no lingering sense of home, only the sharp, sterile tang of industrial polish and the intimidating silence of a mausoleum. Sophia walked through the halls, her modest suitcase feeling heavy against the buffed floors. She realized quickly that Ji-hoon wasn't just living here. He was being preserved. He sat in a massive playroom filled with the world's most expensive gadgets, yet he touched none of them. He remained by the window, a small, solitary figure framed by an ocean of glass, looking out at a world he was never allowed to touch. "It's too quiet in here, little star," Sophia murmured as she entered. Musuk watched from the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest, his presence a dark anchor in the bright room. He watched her with a mixture of suspicion and a desperate, hidden hope. He was a man who understood how to secure a perimeter, but he had no idea how to fill the space inside it. Sophia didn't ask for permission. She began to dismantle the palace of glass from the inside out. She moved the heavy velvet curtains to let in the bruised gold of the afternoon sun. She reorganized the bookshelf, placing the bright, colorful stories within the boy's reach and moving the sterile, educational volumes to the top. From her bag, she pulled a small hand-woven tapestry from home, a burst of saffron and deep indigo, and draped it over the back of a cold leather chair. When Musuk's chief of security protested that the clutter violated protocol, Musuk silenced him with a single sharp glance. He was mesmerized by the way Sophia moved, with a quiet confidence that didn't bow to his status. She didn't treat him like a king or a killer. She treated him like a man who had forgotten to open a window. By the third day, the kitchen, once a workspace for silent, uniformed chefs, smelled of ginger and caramelized onions. Sophia had convinced the cook to step aside, brewing a pot of tea that carried the spicy warmth of her own childhood. She sat on the floor with Ji-hoon, ignoring the proper chairs, and began to tell him a story about a lion who lost his roar and the bird who helped him find it in the wind. Musuk stood in the shadows of the hallway, listening to the unfamiliar sound of his son's soft giggle. It was a fragile, beautiful thing. He realized then that Sophia wasn't just reorganizing his house. She was rearranging the very architecture of his life, turning his fortress into something he hadn't dared to dream of, a home. The dining room table was a vast, obsidian lake that usually demanded silence and silver service. Tonight Sophia had reclaimed it. She had banished the stiff linens and the heavy silence, replacing them with mismatched ceramic bowls and the vibrant earthy aroma of thai budayan, a Senegalese rice dish, alongside a steaming plate of Korean gimbap. It was a collision of their worlds, messy and fragrant. Musuk stood at the head of the table, looking at the colorful spread as if it were a complex tactical map he didn't know how to decode. He was still in his suit, his tie loosened but his posture as rigid as a sentry. Ji-hoon sat to his right, his eyes wide, watching the steam rise from the bowls. "Sit, Mr. Han," Sophia said, her voice a gentle nudge. "Not as a director of a syndicate, just as a hungry man." Musuk sat, his movements hesitant. He looked at his son, then at Sophia. "What is the protocol for this?" he asked, his voice low. "There is no protocol for love," Sophia replied, placing a generous serving of rice on Ji-hoon's plate before sliding the bowl toward Musuk. "In my home, the person who speaks first is the one who found the most beauty in their day. Even if it was just the way the light hit a puddle." The silence that followed wasn't the suffocating quiet of the previous weeks. It was an expectant pause. Musuk cleared his throat, his gaze dropping to his hands. He looked at Ji-hoon, who was tentatively picking up a piece of gimbap. "I saw." Musuk started, his voice cracking slightly. He stopped, took a breath and tried again. "I saw a bird today, Ji-hoon. It was building a nest in the crane outside my office window. It was small, but it wasn't afraid of heights." Ji-hoon stopped chewing. He looked up at his father, his dark eyes shimmering with a sudden, intense focus. It was a simple observation, a mundane detail, but to the boy it was a bridge. It was the first time his father had offered him a piece of his world that wasn't a command or a lesson. "Was it blue?" Ji-hoon whispered. Musuk leaned in, the marble mask of his face finally softening into something human. "No. It was gray, with wings that looked like silver when the sun hit them." For the next hour, the language of the heart took over. Sophia sat back, a silent architect watching her construction hold firm. She watched Musuk learn to navigate the terrain of a 7-year-old's curiosity. She watched him realize that he didn't need to be a fortress to be a father. He just needed to be a person. By the time the meal ended, Ji-hoon's plate was messy, and Musuk's sleeves were rolled up. There were no executions ordered, no territories defended. There was only a father and a son, sitting in the warm glow of a kitchen that finally felt like the center of a home. Sophia cleared the plates, her heart full, knowing the hardest part of the journey was yet to come, but the first step had been taken in the scent of ginger and the sound of a child's voice. The warmth of the dining room felt like a distant memory the moment Sophia stepped into the hallway and saw the flickering blue light of a dozen surveillance monitors. In the security hub, the air was cold again, smelling of ozone and static. Musuk was hunched over a console, his face illuminated by the harsh glow of frozen frames from the restaurant, the street, and the estate's perimeter. "You shouldn't be in here," he said, but his voice lacked its usual bite. It sounded heavy, burdened by a realization he hadn't wanted to face. Sophia walked toward the screens. On one, she saw a grainier version of herself, the invisible African walking to the bus stop. In the background of the shot, a car she didn't recognize was trailing 3 lengths behind. In another frame, a man she had seen lingering near the restaurant's service entrance was leaning against a street lamp, his eyes fixed on her. "They are looking for a weakness," Musuk whispered, his eyes never leaving the monitors. "For 15 years I had none. I was a man of stone. But now they see a waitress who moved into the fortress. They see a boy who has stopped crying. They see that I have something to lose." The outsider's price hit Sophia with the force of a physical blow. By stepping into the light to save Ji-hoon, She had stepped out of the safety of her anonymity. She was no longer a ghost in the machine of the city. She was a target etched in high definition. The very empathy that had bridged the gap between a father and son had now painted a bullseye on all their backs. "The Park Syndicate," Musuk continued, gesturing to a man in a dark coat caught on camera near Sophia's old apartment. "They don't strike at the walls of the fortress. They strike at the heart that lives inside it." Sophia felt a chill that the estate's heating system couldn't touch. She thought of her mother's letters, the wire transfers she sent home, and the quiet life she had fought so hard to build. She looked at Musuk, seeing the agony of a man who had finally found something worth holding on to, only to realize his hands were too stained with blood to keep it safe. "I am a danger to you," she said softly, the words tasting like ash. Musuk turned then, his eyes searching hers with a desperate intensity. "No, I am the danger to you. But you are the only one who makes Ji-hoon feel like the world isn't a cage." He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder before dropping away, as if he feared his touch alone would mark her for death. Sophia realized that being seen by a man like Musuk was the most beautiful and terrifying thing that had ever happened to her. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a player in a game where the stakes were life and soul. The outing was supposed to be a peace offering, a trip to the botanical gardens where the air smelled of damp earth and the white lilies bloomed in abundance. For a few hours, the palace of glass was replaced by the rustle of leaves and Ji-hoon's wide-eyed wonder. Musuk had traded his charcoal suit for a dark sweater, though the shadows beneath his eyes remained. He walked a step behind Sophia and his son, watching them with the intensity of a man trying to memorize a dream before he woke up. The breach didn't happen with a roar, but with a sudden, unnatural silence. The birds in the conservatory stopped singing. Sophia felt the shift first, the same prickle on her skin she'd felt in the restaurant before the Han Syndicate arrived. She saw a flash of silver in the dense green of the fern gully, a barrel extending from the foliage. "Down!" she screamed, not waiting for the guards. She didn't retreat, she lunged. Sophia threw her body over Ji-hoon, shielding him with her own frame as the first muffled thud of a suppressed round shattered a terracotta pot inches from where the boy had been standing. Shards of clay sprayed the air like shrapnel. She tucked the child into the hollow of a stone bench, her voice a low, steady anchor in the chaos. "Stay small, little star. Keep your eyes on me. Only me." Musuk changed in an instant. The father Sophia had spent weeks coaxing to the surface vanished, replaced by the monster the city feared. His face didn't twist in rage. It went terrifyingly blank. He didn't seek cover. He moved toward the source of the fire with a predatory, calculated speed that made him look less like a man and more like a force of nature. His men engaged, the quiet garden erupting into a storm of glass and gunfire. Musuk reached the gunman before his guards could, his hands moving with a lethal efficiency that Sophia had only read about in nightmares. He wasn't just neutralizing a threat. He was dismantling it. The Mafia instincts, the ancient blood-soaked roar of his past, had taken complete control. Even after the intruder was pinned, Musuk's grip didn't loosen. His eyes were void of light, his knuckles bruised as he prepared to deliver a final, brutal judgment. "Mr. Han." Sophia's voice cut through the ringing in his ears. She stood 20 feet away, her arms still wrapped tightly around a trembling Ji-hoon. Her dress was torn, and a thin line of blood tracked down her cheek from a flying shard of clay, but her gaze was unwavering. She wasn't looking at him with fear, but with a profound, soul-deep disappointment. "Don't let him see this," she pleaded, her voice trembling but loud. "If you do this, you lose him. You lose everything we built." Musuk froze, his hand inches from the man's throat. He looked at the bruised lilies on the ground, then at the terrified face of his son peeking from behind Sophia's shoulder. The monster roared one last time, then went silent. He let go, his hands shaking as the adrenaline ebbed away, leaving him standing in the wreckage of their perfect day, realizing that the blood on his hands was the only thing Sophia couldn't clean away. The aftermath of the garden attack didn't smell like lilies. It smelled of gunpowder and the cold metallic tang of iron. Back at the estate, the palace of glass felt more like a tomb than a sanctuary. Musuk paced the length of the obsidian-floored study, his silhouette jagged against the city lights. He had already spent 3 hours on the phone, his voice a low growl as he coordinated a retaliation that would leave his rivals in ashes. Sophia stood in the doorway, her silhouette steady despite the bandage on her cheek. She had just tucked Ji-hoon into bed. The boy had fallen asleep clutching the small hand-woven tapestry she had brought from Dakar, his only tether to safety. The hit was ordered by the Park brothers, Musuk said, his back to her. His hands were still swollen, his knuckles a roadmap of the violence he had dispensed in the garden. By dawn they will no longer exist. I will make sure no one ever looks at this house with ill intent again. And then what, Musuk? Sophia's voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that stopped his pacing. It was the first time she had used his name without a title, and the sound of it seemed to strip away his armor. He turned, his eyes bloodshot and fierce. Then we are safe. No, she said, stepping into the room. Then you are just a king sitting on a higher pile of bodies. Ji-hoon didn't see a protector today. He saw the monster his mother tried to hide him from. He saw the man who makes people bleed. Musuk flinched as if she had struck him. I did it for him. I did it for you. I know, Sophia whispered, her empathy warring with her resolve. But you cannot raise a child in a storm and wonder why he's always shivering. You told me you hired me to be his bridge back to the world, but you're still building walls of lead and bone. She walked to the desk, placing her hand on the cold obsidian. I love the man who told my son about the gray bird. I respect the man who tried to learn the language of the heart. But I cannot stay to watch that man be swallowed by the boss. The ultimatum hung in the air, sharper than any blade. Sophia didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. You have 2 worlds, Musuk. One where you are feared and alone, and one where you are loved and vulnerable. You can be the boss or you can be a father. But you cannot be both and keep Ji-hoon whole. If the boss stays, I take the boy and we leave. I won't let his soul become collateral damage in your war. Musuk looked at her, then at the security monitors reflecting a world of endless conflict. For the first time in his life, the most powerful man in the city looked truly terrified. He looked at his hands, the hands that had dismantled a man and the hands that had shared gimbap with a child, and he realized he had to choose which version of himself deserved to survive. The aftermath of the garden attack didn't smell like lilies. It smelled of gunpowder and the cold metallic tang of iron. Back at the estate, the palace of glass felt more like a tomb than a sanctuary. Musuk paced the length of the obsidian-floored study, his silhouette jagged against the city lights. He had already spent 3 hours on the phone, his voice a low growl as he coordinated a retaliation that would leave his rivals in ashes. Sophia stood in the doorway, her silhouette steady despite the bandage on her cheek. She had just tucked Ji-hoon into bed. The boy had fallen asleep clutching the small hand-woven tapestry she had brought from Dakar, his only tether to safety. The hit was ordered by the Park brothers, Musuk said, his back to her. His hands were still swollen, his knuckles a roadmap of the violence he had dispensed in the garden. By dawn they will no longer exist. I will make sure no one ever looks at this house with ill intent again. And then what, Musuk? Sophia's voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that stopped his pacing. It was the first time she had used his name without a title, and the sound of it seemed to strip away his armor. He turned, his eyes bloodshot and fierce. Then we are safe. No, she said, stepping into the room. Then you are just a king sitting on a higher pile of bodies. Ji-hoon didn't see a protector today. He saw the monster his mother tried to hide him from. He saw the man who makes people bleed. Musuk flinched as if she had struck him. I did it for him. I did it for you. I know, Sophia whispered, her empathy warring with her resolve. But you cannot raise a child in a storm and wonder why he's always shivering. You told me you hired me to be his bridge back to the world, but you're still building walls of lead and bone. She walked to the desk, placing her hand on the cold obsidian. I love the man who told my son about the gray bird. I respect the man who tried to learn the language of the heart. But I cannot stay to watch that man be swallowed by the boss. The ultimatum hung in the air, sharper than any blade. Sophia didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. You have two worlds, Musuk. One where you are feared and alone, and one where you are loved and vulnerable. You can be the boss or you can be a father. But you cannot be both and keep Ji-hoon whole. If the boss stays, I take the boy and we leave. I won't let his soul become collateral damage in your war. Musuk looked at her, then at the security monitors reflecting a world of endless conflict. For the first time in his life, the most powerful man in the city looked truly terrified. He looked at his hands, the hands that had dismantled a man and the hands that had shared gimbap with a child, and he realized he had to choose which version of himself deserved to survive. 10 years had passed, yet the light in the garden of the Han estate felt entirely new. The obsidian desk was gone, replaced by a workspace of warm oak and scattered sketches. The palace of glass no longer felt like a filtered vacuum. It breathed with the scent of Senegalese jasmine and the lingering warmth of a kitchen that never truly went cold. Musuk stood on the terrace, watching the sunset bleed gold across the city skyline. He wore a simple linen shirt, his sleeves rolled up to reveal scars that had faded but would never fully disappear. The transition had been a jagged, dangerous road, unwinding decades of power, making amends, and turning the Han Syndicate into a legitimate global logistics firm. There had been threats and lean years, but he had traded the crown of a king for the peace of a man who could sleep without a gun beneath his pillow. Thinking about the bird again? A voice asked. He turned to see Sophia. She had become the undisputed heart of the house. Her quiet strength now the foundation upon which their life was built. She ran a foundation for immigrant families, a bridge of her own making that had turned her invisibility into a beacon. She reached out, her hand finding his, her touch as grounding as it had been that first night in the restaurant. I was thinking about the lilies, Musuk admitted, pulling her closer. About how they only bloom when the rain is heavy enough to break the ground. A burst of laughter erupted from the lawn below. Ji-hoon, now 17 and tall with his father's broad shoulders, was showing a group of friends the garden Sophia had helped him cultivate. He wasn't the haunted, silent boy in the miniature suit anymore. He was a young man who moved with a grace that came from security, not fear. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ji-hoon looked up toward the terrace. He caught his father's eye and flashed a wide, brilliant smile. A look of pure, unburdened light that Musuk had once thought was lost forever. It was his mother's joy, preserved and nurtured by the woman who had dared to speak when everyone else stayed silent. He's happy, Musuk whispered, the words still feeling like a miracle. He's home, Sophia corrected, leaning her head against his shoulder. In the city that had once tried to erase them, they were no longer shadows or ghosts. They were a family. A living thing grown from the ruins of a fortress, proving that even the hardest heart can be taught the language of the sun. As the stars began to hide in the grass, Han Musuk finally let go of the world he had conquered to cherish the one he had found.